Hello and welcome to another episode of the Daily Remedy Podcast. Today, I'm going to be discussing something that's quite important both to Daily Remedy and to our readers, and that is surveys, polling, and data. Since Daily Remedy began, we always focused on patient surveys, physician surveys to glean information about healthcare perceptions at the moment they're forming when healthcare content is read, or just general perspectives and views about key healthcare issues or policies. Now, I'm proud to announce we're taking this to a whole new level and partnering with the Real Clear Policy as part of the Real Clear Politics umbrella. And with that, we're going to have access to polling data, to healthcare policy data, to the extent that we never could have imagined before. And what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to share the data with you like we do everything else. But seriously, what we want to do is assess the perception of the polls themselves. Now, what does that even mean? A lot of big words in a row. When you look at polls, they tell a story of aggregate information, right? 10 people are surveyed about what color cats they like. Each person answers differently, but in aggregate, you get a sense of what is the more likely colors that a person would like, the more popular colors of a cat. Simple enough. But polls have errors, right? We see that every election year that the polls will say one thing and the election outcome is another thing. Now, we mostly chalk that up to people not being honest or not wanting to disclose their true feelings. But I think there's something more to that. I think there's a phenomenon that occurs when you aggregate all the information, patient perceptions, provider perspectives, into a broad data set. Something happens when the data becomes aggregated. It takes on a particular complexity, and that complexity creates errors. Because, as I alluded to in Burden of Pain, an extensive amount, uncertainty and complexity are two sides of the same coin. The more complex things get, the more uncertain they get, which is just a fancy way of saying there's going to be a lot of error. But how we assess that error is critical. When we talk about polling data in the most famous of polls, we usually talk about errors in elections, errors in nominating a candidate and the likelihood that he or she will win. I want to take that more granularly and focus on healthcare. What are the sources of error in healthcare polling data that create a disconnect between the patient experience and the general understanding of what's going on in the patient care continuum? I'll give an example. Patients always talk about the experience of healthcare matters the most. So, clinicians, with all our wisdom and insight, created patient satisfaction metrics. The Press-Ganey scores, the HCAP scores, all these metrics that effectively say, how did you like your healthcare experience? Would you like to come back to the same healthcare facility again? Would you recommend said healthcare facility? Now, these questions came from the intent that the patient experience matters. So they were formed by taking retail experience questions and transforming them into healthcare experience questions, and then giving them to the public to answer based on when they came to the hospital or not. It seems like a simple enough line of logic, but the moment you start aggregating all this data, transferring it from one industry to the other, accumulating input, making assumptions off of those inputs, you're going to get errors, right? That's effectively the most simple example I can think of where the more complex data becomes, the more uncertain it derives an outcome. So the question then becomes, where did that error form? If you trace out the line of logic, retail experience questions, healthcare experience questions, ask a patient, Aggregate the data. Seems simple enough, right? There's a logical framework by which you can assess how the data came. Within each step, there are leaps of logic that are correct and that are incorrect, errors of judgment. Those errors accumulate and create mistakes, right? So we know this at a broad level. We see this after the fact when it becomes more apparent, but we don't see it in real time. And so we don't understand it when it's forming. And so that's why I always talk about patient perceptions. I'm not trying to just wax poetic about the philosophy of healthcare. I'm really trying to get at something that's critical in why health policy fails healthcare and why the patient can't understand what's going on with the healthcare system as a whole. These are fundamental disconnects that are hard to contextualize. It's almost a paradox. We see it, but we can't truly contextualize it in a way that creates meaningful understanding. So, why am I going off on this tangent? I believe that by getting healthcare polling data from realclear policy, we will then be able to analyze those polls and glean key perceptions of where the errors lie in those polls. The point is not to criticize any one source of data, any one poll, or any one survey method, but rather to emphasize that this methodology of constructing surveys, questionnaires, and then gleaning input and then aggregating that input into certain forms of feedback is an inherently error-prone process, particularly so in healthcare. So if we can understand how it's forming, when it forms, we can create better policies for patients because we better understand how patients are truly thinking. It's the perceptions of the polls, how we're gleaning information and analyzing it in real time to see if what we're constructing is correct or not. Or are we creating errors as we're building together response after response? So stay tuned. In the next coming months, we're going to be obtaining data, polling data, feeding it into Daily Remedy, presenting it to you, the reader, and asking you for your feedback. Does this poll agree with what you truly believe? Now, some of you may disagree with the polls, and that's because your perspective is a true outlier. You just simply don't think what most people think, and that's okay. But if the poll is intending on reflecting what you're thinking and there's error in that outcome, that's an issue. Not because you disagree with the poll, but because the poll doesn't accurately reflect what you truly believe. So that's kind of parsing through the weeds, but it's a critical distinction to make. Aggregate data and broad trends are never going to reflect every individual's belief because we all think differently, right? There's inherent variance in all that we think, say, and act. People are different. At a certain level, that variance is unaccounted for, and that's unforeseen error. And that's where the critical element in healthcare discontinuity between broader trends and individual beliefs form. So we're going to parse through the data, look through the sources of error, glean feedback, and really identify how accurately do the polls demonstrate patient perceptions. So stay tuned, look for the surveys, and make sure you continue to participate. Thank you.